So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Doug Berkey, Executive Director for the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Aerospace Nation series. I'd like to thank Dr. Ron Epstein for joining us today. He's Managing Director in Equity Research at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, where he covers the aerospace and defense sector, as well as multinational industrials with large aerospace components. Ron has also served as a research scientist at the Applied Aerodynamics Technology Group at Boeing Phantom Works. He holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from Duke University, as well as an MBA from the Wharton School. Welcome, Ron. Thank you for taking time to join us today. And as we discussed earlier, I particularly enjoy your insights every week as you're on Vago's podcast. What you, Richard, and the other guys do is fantastic. So thank you so much for that. Really keep us informed. So with that, I'd like to start today's session by giving you an opportunity to make some opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to the podcast. That's fun every week. I thought I would kick this off with maybe just setting the scene, and I think there's a couple key points that I want to make. I would say first, the pandemic. Right, the pandemic's had a profound impact on the aerospace and defense industry. More impactful on the commercial side than the defense side. But the two are intertwined, right? So they do play off each other. So for companies in particular that have defense businesses, but also large commercial businesses, it's been impactful there, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later in some of the questions. You have to also throw on top of that the impact that the 737 MAX has had on the industry. You've got a major program that's been grounded almost 18 months now, and that's had a humongous impact, not just on Boeing, but all the suppliers who supply into that. Right. It's kind of like a double whammy, right? You've got the 737 issue, and then on top of it, the pandemic. So if you're a mid-sized or smaller supplier that's exposed to both, the environment could be pretty tough right now. The second point I'd make is, and maybe we've seen more of a kick up in this post-pandemic, but I mean, as you know, this has started a while back. I mean, the great power of competition, right, it has really firmed up a lot. And particularly, in the economics and investment community, you've seen the discussion over the last, call it 18 months to 2 years, shift from a trade war to a tech war to even now a capital war, where you're talking about different restrictions on Chinese companies, or actually maybe call it consistent restrictions on Chinese companies that want to do IPOs in the U.S. And then you've got, about 250 or so Chinese companies listed on U.S. exchanges that have different, audit requirements than other companies. And there's a talk of, actually, I think they passed it, of making the audit requirements for those companies the same as U.S. companies. So, you've got that going on. We've got the presidential election, right? And that adds yet another layer of some uncertainty into, the politics of defense, the politics of the broader economy, and, what impacts changes in tax rates will have on capital investment and so on and so forth. So, between, the uncertainty with the pandemic, the uncertainty with the China, the uncertainty with presidential elections, you've got a lot of things piling up that have, right, driven a lot of volatility in thinking. A fourth point that I think is important, that will, I think, become more important as we go out over the next couple of years, is the level of the deficit. I mean, we're spending levels now that we haven't seen since World War II, and that, I think it would be unrealistic to think that can't have some impact in some way on how the government runs, how the government spends, and how the government allocates its capital as we go out in the future, right? And one concern there is what impact that'll have on defense spending. And then finally, just if we didn't have a pandemic and we didn't have the spending, we didn't have everything that's going on, we're still, history would suggest, approaching the high point in the current defense spending cycle, right? I mean, that the trough in defense spending was in 2015, and it looks like defense cycles last maybe 7 to 10 years. You're pushing 7 years, so you filter out everything else. Just history would suggest you're getting towards what you would think of as maybe a peak in defense spending, at least in kind of real terms, in the next couple of years. So with that, that's how I would set the scene.
No, it's a really challenging and interesting time, and like we were saying earlier, there are things playing out right now that none of us really could have imagined a couple months ago. So, obviously it's all highly turbulent, it's uncertain. And so as a trained engineer and analyst, you've had a unique perspective on defense aviation as a business and space systems. So if you're to take a top-down look at the sector today, what are the stories that are of greatest importance, and what are the things that we're missing but we should be tracking?
Sure. I think, the probably, the stories of greatest importance are pretty obvious now. The impact that the pandemic's had on commercial aerospace. And just to name two large companies, the Boeing company and Raytheon Technologies, they have very significant commercial aerospace businesses. They also have significant defense businesses. And in some cases, those commercial businesses were helping them do investments in the defense business. And I'm not just highlighting those two companies. There's many companies like that, smaller size and in the supply chain. So that the stress on the commercial businesses has, had a second order effect on companies, what they can do in their defense business. And some of the more healthy commercial companies, companies with balance sheets that are a little stronger, we've seen them make investments in defense. So you're seeing a bit of a pivot to defense markets from commercial aerospace markets, kind of across market caps in companies. So I think that's kind of one of the obvious things to keep an eye on. I would say another thing that is, I think, very, very important to keep an eye on, and this is something we've talked about in the past, and I think it gets glossed over, the way our current defense procurement system is set up, it doesn't promote a lot of innovation at the highest levels. So when you look at the biggest primes, they tend to innovate by buying smaller companies, and they're not incented to do a lot of innovation, at their level. If you look at the amount of skin in the game that a large defense prime in the U.S. would typically spend, their true sweat equity, it's generally pretty low. And that's not a criticism of them; they're just not incented to do so, right? So I think one of the things we got to keep an eye on is how do you keep the defense contractors incented to make those investments. And then I think one of the things that investors are starting to look at and people are starting to look at, and it's really coming of age, is commercial space. Right, that's one of the things we're watching. We're doing more work on. Virgin Galactic really kind of brought that to light for the capital markets, because they're the first publicly traded commercial space company. But there's a lot of activity going on in commercial space, and it really seems like you've gotten to a point where the maturation of the technology is there, that things that were once just the purview of governments and the interplay between governments and large defense contractors actually now has some play in the commercial markets.
So picking up what you're talking about with innovation, during a recent Aerospace Nation event that we hosted earlier this year, Dr. Will Roper underscored the importance of what he calls the digital holy trinity, a strategy designed to modernize U.S. defense industrial base and accelerate the pace of development. What's your take on how companies are responding to this vector?
Yeah, so when you think about the digital holy trinity, right? It's big words. It's digital engineering, software development, and modular open systems. Right? So that's the kind of the holy trinity, you call it. So it's model-based systems engineering. A lot of words. I would say a couple things. You've seen this occur naturally in commercial markets over time. I think the way it's been pitched, it's this big revolution, but it's really been an evolution, largely driven in commercial markets, but also applied to defense markets. So I guess for myself, I don't see it as that big a shift in honestly how things are done. You have to bear in mind too that the model-based engineering is only good as the models that you build, and ultimately the devil is always in the details, right? And some of those details you can only get at by getting your hands dirty. I mean, so that the simulation part of it and the model-based systems part of it clearly can help, right? But it's in my humble opinion, it's not the end all be all, and it can't replace, actually building something, testing it, getting it out there. And to be clear, this like I said, just to reiterate, this has been an evolution in the commercial side for sure, and it's very hard to believe that it wasn't applied in the defense side. So I think what was articulated is right, but it's not like someone flicked a switch and all of a sudden everything became model based. It's been a natural evolution that will probably continue to evolve.
Yeah. So last month, Dr. Roper announced that the Air Force has constructed an airframe for 6th generation fighters within a year using a new E-system model. He says this approach will reshape the way in which the Air Force does business. How do you think this announcement has been received by companies working in the sector?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think there was probably a little bit of surprise because it was done on the hush hush, right? I mean, the world, besides those who needed to know, didn't know until they told the world. So I'm certain there was some level of surprise. But they built a prototype, and our understanding is it was for maybe $1.7, $1.8 billion. And they did that. We think, we've been told they flew it. But a prototype isn't a final production aircraft. And then the journey from prototype to a production program, that can take a lot of time, industrialization process and everything. So, is it a step in the right direction? Sure. Has it been done in the past, though? Sure. I mean, if you look at the rich history of the Lockheed Skunk Works, they brought to market innovative aircraft, in secret pretty quickly. So, I mean, it's nice that it happened, but it's happened before. It'll probably happen again. And it's not a production program yet. If that makes sense, right? And again, so I don't know how earth-shattering it is for the industry. On some levels, kind of expected.
Yeah, no, going off your point, there's a big difference between have blue and the F-117. And so obviously you need the demonstrators, and that's really important, but it is different than an operational capability. So the next question is really about space commercialization. Here at Mitchell, we're very interested in the public-private partnerships that are driving much of the U.S. space activity today. How do you expect the relationship between DoD and commercial entities to evolve over time?
Yeah, I think you've seen a good blueprint for that with SpaceX and the Air Force. Really, who would have imagined 15, 20 years ago that a private company would be in the commercial launch business? And in fact, not just in the commercial launch business selling kit, but selling the service, right? Selling rides to space for payloads, of which some are military. So if you look at how SpaceX has worked with the government, both the Air Force and with NASA, I mean, I think it really is a nice blueprint on how, on a go-forward basis, you'll see that happen. And then to be fair, it's not just SpaceX. I mean, there's many companies working in commercial space that on some level have interaction with the government. You look at Virgin Galactic, right? I mean, they have an interaction with NASA. Their management is staffed with NASA alumni,
right? And
that naturally kind of lends itself to an interplay between the government and commercial space. I think what's most interesting about it is it doesn't seem to be a competition between government and commercial entities, but it really does seem to be a nice symbiotic relationship with the two working with each other, kind of for each other. And I would expect to see that continue because it really has been so successful, at first with SpaceX, but we'll see it, kind of, I believe, proliferate out to other companies in space markets.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, you released a pretty interesting market forecast recently talking about growth in the space sector. Could you touch upon that a little bit?
Yeah, so we did a primer recently on space markets, and we're forecasting if you go out that space markets today are about $400 billion approximately, and if you go out over the next 20 years, we're expecting them to grow to about 1.4 trillion.
Wow!
And part of that is you're having a bigger focus on space, as we all know, in military markets. But that piece I was talking about, commercial markets are maturing too. A small piece of that is space tourism, but also you have everything from distributed satellites, CubeSats, that kind of thing, getting a bigger piece of the market over time. And then ultimately the development of a cislunar economy. So an economy that's in space, that's generated in space, right? So if you think about everything, the dollars that are generated in space today, it's really everything in space looking back at Earth, and everything that's been put in space starts in Earth. So it's an economy that's terrestrial, that kind of goes out and comes back. What we expect to see happen is a space-based economy. Mm-hmm. So you'll have assets in space generating revenue in space, and then they stay in space. Everything probably at first starting with refueling satellites, moving satellites around, that kind of thing, and then that will transition to, by our views today, kind of more exotic stuff, asteroid mining, that kind of thing, where you have revenue generating assets in space that are generating the revenue in space.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing in so many different ways. So bringing it back a little closer here to home, the COVID crisis has really placed immense strain on aerospace firms, especially those with civil aerospace exposure. You touched upon it in your opening remarks, but could you go a little bit deeper about these dynamics and how is this impacting the supply chain enterprise?
Yeah, so if you look at what the pandemic has done in just what's called aerospace and defense markets, on the commercial side, it's been hugely profound. If you go back in sort of the modern jet age, before this downturn in commercial, we had three others in the early 90s, during the financial crisis and after September 11th, so 2002, 2009, and 1991, 92. In those previous downturns, your decline in global air traffic was about 3%, 2 to 3%. So one would consider just sort of kind of a horrific downturn, high single digits, right? So if you saw global air traffic go down 8 or 9%, that'd been just earth shattering. This time when it's all said and done, most likely global air traffic in 2020 will be down somewhere between 60 to 70%, maybe 65%. And we probably won't get back to 2019 levels of air traffic at best. 2023, most likely more like 2024, 2025. Yeah. So the impact on the commercial aerospace industry has been, you hear this a lot, but unprecedented. Yeah. It's huge. You never would imagine that something this bad could happen, and it happened on the heels of the best upcycle in history. Mm-hmm. Both Boeing and Airbus were building a lot of airplanes and doing quite well. The supply chains were doing well. You started to see a little bit of a slowdown in the wide body market, but everything was controlled and well behaved, and then boom, this kind of came out of nowhere. So you're in the process now of seeing, not just the airlines readjusting their businesses and resizing, but the entire commercial aerospace side of A&D. Now, like I mentioned before, many of the contractors and suppliers have significant commercial businesses, and they're confronted with, laying off, engineers, workforce decisions, not just engineers. It's very skilled labor in manufacturing facilities. So just a skilled labor force that they're being forced to downsize, how they have to resize their businesses, questions about investing in new programs. And like I mentioned, for a lot of companies, their commercial business can be, generating some of the capital that they would invest in their defense business. Now that's off the table. And in many circumstances, you'd have labor, particularly engineering labor, that could go back and forth between, commercial and defense, and you're going to lose part of that. Defense markets, fortunately, are in a reasonable spot, right? So the defense end market has held robustly. Not that it's been completely free of the pandemic impact. I mean, there's been an impact, but it's been much more muted. It's been smaller. It's been much more manageable. So it's that's where we are.
Yeah, if you look at human capital, obviously it's so crucial for innovation, for quality production, and it's not something that can be ginned up overnight. And as bleak as those numbers are that you just discussed, I mean, we are going to come out of this, and there still is a significant amount of defense aerospace activity in play that'll continue. And so how do you see companies posturing to maintain that capital as best they can when budgets are tight across the board?
Yeah, it's a difficult equation to balance, right? And it's something we worry about. So just as an example, with the 787 production line at Boeing, they're shifting it as they need to one production facility. So 787 production is going from a peak of 14 per month. Boeing has publicly said they'll be at 6 per month next year. We believe it'll actually be a little bit lower than that. You can't have two lines sensibly. I mean, you just can't. So they're going to have to, shut down one line. They've already come out and said they're going to move 787 stuff to South Carolina,
right?
Their campus there in North Charleston. We worry about the workforce in Washington. You've got generations of skilled labor, both engineering and skilled craftsmen. What's going to happen to them? I mean, ultimately, they will migrate to other fields, and then kind of what happens to that. That how do you call it? That institutional knowledge base of folks in the Puget Sound region. We worry about, as an example, right? So, and there'll be other examples that across the industry, and it's a hard balance, right? The companies that have more defense, you can shift some folks over to defense and try to balance it with defense. But even Boeing, who's a huge defense contractor, over almost 60% of their revenue in the upcycle was from commercial. So when that really gets slammed like it is now, it's hard. And those are very difficult management decisions to make that I'm certain none of the companies are taking lightly. But it's a real issue. And what we worry about is ultimately this will pass, right? You see in the press and you hear travel will never be the same. I don't believe that. I do believe that we'll get back to some level of normalcy. But then that means everything's going to have to ramp up again. So where is this workforce when everything has to ramp up again? And I worry about that. That because of the severity of the downturn now, that you're actually kind of putting the future ramp up at risk.
No, I understand. And a question building off of that, and you don't really hear about this, but if you look at, the Air Force, it is in very dire need of recapitalization and resetting of its airframes and all that. Do you think politically there will be awareness on the Hill and other places as they're looking at budgets that it's a way of kind of sustaining the health of the aerospace sector by continuing higher build rates and multiple recap efforts concurrently?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I do believe that story is being told, and to be fair, it's not a story. That's reality, right? So if you can put more throughput through the defense side of the industry, that can help support the commercial side now. And ultimately, when you see companies that have made investments in both commercial and defense, there's historically there's been a counter cyclicality to the businesses. So it's the defense business now that you really want. You'd really like to have kind of hold things together if you can. And to your point, with the Air Force, there is a meaningful requirement for more airframes. So, why not take this opportunity and use the capacity that's there and try to fulfill that now? So supporting the industry in a very productive sort of way. I hope that's how it plays out. I don't know, right? And that kind of gets back to the presidential election cycle, cycle, who's controlling in the backdrop of a deficit that will be as big as we've seen since World War II, at least as a percentage of GDP.
No, speaking about the defense budget and all, current health and economic crises have obviously raised questions about the future defense spending. How do you see this impacting the overall top line? Do you see there being a big difference between a Biden administration versus Trump too? How are you reading the Hill? What are the variables in play here?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We build a model. We've been doing this for the better part of 15 years, where we look at roll call voting trends in Congress. And you can take those roll call votes, all the votes of every Congress since the beginning of the country, and you can map them into XY space and make a political map. It's really kind of cool. We didn't invent that. There was two political scientists Dr. Poole and Dr. Rosenthal. One of them was at Princeton at the time, and I think one was at University of California, San Diego. And they came up with this mapping process. And in fact, they built a long, distinguished academic career looking at, quote unquote, they came up with political polarization and what that means and mapping it. We found the data and we apply it. And what's fascinating with that is you can use that data and forecast a lot of things about the government and spending, and we use it for the defense budget. And what it tells us is this: of all the candidates that could have become president, you have the two that are the best for defense spending, right? So between a Trump administration or potentially a Biden administration, Mr. Biden or Vice President Biden and President Trump were the two that would probably be the best for defense spending. Then kind of what comes down now is, and it turns out the most important variable is who controls the Senate. So if you're in a backdrop now where, say, you have a Biden administration and Congress, the makeup of Congress is about the same, that's, from a defense outlook perspective, at least the model suggests that's not so bad. If you get into a scenario where you have a Democrat sweep, that's probably a step down from there. And interestingly enough, probably the worst case would be you have Democrat control of the White House, Democrat control of the Senate, but Republican control of the House, which that looks like it's kind of not in the cards. But in that case, you end up with like the reemergence of a Tea Party kind of dynamic, and spending really gets killed. So kind of the worst case is off the table. So now it's sort of what middle case do we end up with? And it's sort of like best case is things are flattish in nominal terms. In worst case, you see probably mid-single digit declines over a period of years in overall defense spending, maybe a little bit less in the investment accounts, depending on how it's allocated, but that's how it looks right now.
Wow. Do you see firms taking actions to kind of anticipate potential downturns?
I think they're trying to, but if you look at the last election as a lesson, kind of the world thought it was going to go one way and then it went another way. Mm-hmm. So I think, kind of what we see in firms they're cognizant that we're probably in a slowing defense spending environment, but exactly how slow is a bit of a question mark. And the politics, until we know what happens in November, are still a bit of a question mark. So I think firms are thinking about it, hedging a little bit, strategizing, but until you kind of know how it plays out, you don't know. But I think for sure across the board, firms are preparing for some level of slowdown in defense spending. It just is, they have to tune the magnitude. Is it going to be in terms of slowdown? Is it a big slowdown, a modest slowdown? And that still has to play out.
Well, no, it's interesting times indeed. So looking at a marquee program for the Air Force, ABMS, the Air Force recently selected 15 additional companies to compete to develop new capabilities for advanced battle management system. And that brings the total number of firms engaged in the program to over 50. So some of these companies are startups, while others are relatively new to the defense contracting world. Do you think this approach will be effective over the long term in bringing commercially oriented companies into partnerships with DoD? And honestly, what's motivating them to participate in bureaucratic process not known for efficiency or speed? Because obviously, especially in the tech market, time is money.
Yeah, for sure. I think the motivation, not to be crass, is money. Mm-hmm. It's a source of funding. It's a source of support, and potentially a stable one. So for a startup, this is an alternative funding source that doesn't dilute the capital base of the company. You're not giving up ownership of the company. But it's a way to get some financial support. So in some of the work we do, we do see that. Can it potentially bring innovation into defense markets? Yeah, for sure it can. And what you hope to see is that this can broaden the relationship between the Department of Defense and with some smaller contractors. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And by bringing them in early and young, if you will, and learning, one of the things you hear from private companies who don't like to play in defense is everything you pointed out. It's highly bureaucratic. The procurement process, you need you have to set up the overhead of just having a company do procurement is huge. If you bring them in when they're young and they figure out how to do it as a small company, maybe they can do it more efficiently and learn how to work with DoD from, if you will, when they're just sort of children. and grow up with it, as opposed to try to lay all this in on them once they're a more mature company. But ultimately, I think it's seen as a stable funding source, and a funding source, at least at that level for small companies, really I believe does promote innovation. So it's money that can come without a lot of strings, that is seeking innovation, because you're not seeing that innovation that higher up the food chain.
No, it is really interesting, and boy, the amount of overhead, though, as you point out, is significant if you want to do business with the government. So it is a tough one. So looking at global competition, there's been a recent push by companies in the U.S. and abroad to standard pricing for base model fighter aircraft as a way of accelerating sales and gaining access to new markets. What steps are you seeing U.S. companies taking to increase their performance in the global marketplace for advanced aerospace platforms?
Yeah, I think really the poster child for that's been Lockheed Martin with the F-16 program, by offering a standard base vehicle. I mean, it's kind of like a comparison with a car, right? You can get the F-16 LX version, right, and it's a certain cost. And if you want to do upgrades to it, it costs more or less depending on how you change it. You saw recently the 66 aircraft to Taiwan, the 24 aircraft to Morocco that were sold in that kind of process. And I think ideally it's, you can bring something to the market, it can be competitive, and it changes, the cost around doing a foreign military sale, how quickly you can go to market, and maybe even you can set up a foreign military sale as an IDIQ kind of contract. I think a very important one to keep an eye on is the F-16, or call it the F-21, right? In India, that could be another potential market for a standardized version of the aircraft, and in that case, one that'll probably be assembled there, right? So it's standardization with maybe the sweetener of a nice commercial offset or defense offset, if you will, where you can do the fabrication in country. So I think clearly Lockheed's done a lot there on along that protocol of a standardized platform and what to do. And I think there's more to watch there. And that's not to say that other contractors aren't, but I think that's a real clear-cut case where you see a company doing it.
And staying on the international theme for a minute here. Now, China announced last summer that it would place sanctions on U.S. companies that have dealings with Taiwan. Could these actions have a chilling effect on U.S. aerospace firms seeking to engage with Taiwan or other countries in the region?
It's a good question. I hesitate because I think it depends on the company, right? So I believe right now, really the only U.S. A&D company that has a sanction on it's Lockheed Martin. And with all due respect to Beijing, who cares? Yeah. It doesn't who cares? Like it's Lockheed's not doing anything in the region. They're not selling anything to China. It's not clearly it didn't impact the sale of F-16s to Taiwan. But they have no commercial businesses. So when you think about a company that has commercial business in the region, then maybe that's a little bit of a different story, right? So if China were to put sanctions on Boeing, or if China were to put sanctions on Raytheon Technologies, just examples, who have significant commercial businesses, then that might have more teeth. So it really depends on the flavor of revenue that the countries have in region. And as China itself is one of the largest markets for civil aviation in the world, behind the U.S. So to be cut off from the Chinese civil aviation market, could be painful, right? Mm-hmm. So it's that has to go into the calculus of companies that are doing both, and I think it's an open question. What's the best way to navigate that today?
Yeah, understand. So looking a little bit closer to home, you've got R&D and production occurring in different ways these days. And over the last several years, the Air Force has been pouring sizable amounts into R&D efforts with industry. And at the same time, the service is also not scaling a lot of those efforts to production level enterprises. So there comes a point where the Air Force needs capacity, just not innovative ideas. And industry also needs to build things if it's going to justify IRAD investments. So how are these trends impacting industry's confidence levels when it comes to committing internal investment dollars towards new concepts? I mean, build it and they will come is not always a sure bet.
Yeah, kind of the case in point I like to bring up is the Textron Scorpion.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a neat little airplane that Textron Aviation did on their own dollar. Would have some applications in various markets for the U.S. I mean, you can imagine it deployed in the National Guard, if you would, border control, that kind of thing. They built it, and nobody in the U.S. came.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and it kind of gets back to the incentives for companies to invest in R&D. I think the defense primes and the defense industry tends to be a very rational industry. And if there's good incentives to invest, they'll do it. And, it just that's one case in point where you saw an aircraft developed and it didn't happen. Right. And, and I think, that incentive is at control of the DoD, right? I mean, it's so it all comes back to that. So, do I see companies willing to throw a lot of their own skin in the game, take true risk, not reimbursable risk, but true risk? You don't see a lot of it, and that's not a criticism of the companies. They're just being rational, right? If they're not going to get rewarded for it, why should they? So, it's something that I think, I would like to see, and I think probably others would too. If you saw companies rewarded for putting more skin in the game, you would probably see more companies do it.
Right. No, and historically speaking, there have been some important efforts that have been launched through that path. I mean, always remember that's where the U2 came from back in the day. So looking a little bit further afield in non-traditional engagements with the Air Force, the service has recently launched the Agility Prime program to explore concepts for urban air mobility, including the development of passenger carrying aircraft. This is a pretty unusual approach for the Air Force, given that we're talking about traditional defense platforms like fighters or bombers normally. So how is this impacting the market, and do you see it as a sustainable investment given the top line pressures that'll be coming to bear likely?
Yeah, ultimately it's low cost stuff when you think about the magnitude of federal budgets and defense budgets. It's low cost stuff, but it's technologies that I don't think can be ignored. You're seeing maturation in things like electronic flight control systems, power management systems, battery technology that are getting to a point where these systems can really be made. And I think it would be short-sighted for both commercial or defense industry not to explore what could be done there, because if there's a viable platform or a viable usage of this technology for both commercial and defense applications, somebody will find it, right? So particularly in matters of national security in the defense industry, it would be nice if we found it instead of one of our adversaries. And for the cost to do it, it just doesn't seem like it's that taxing to do it. So it's I don't I would like to see that continue, and I would hate to see that kind of more I call it basic research get cut off because the price tag actually in the big scope of things isn't that big. Now you are seeing, as an example, kind of getting back to a couple questions ago, Boeing said they're going to they have their Boeing Next unit that was looking at some of these technologies, and they're going to shut that down. And again, that's not a criticism of Boeing, but that's just a byproduct of their commercial market being so slammed right now that it's something they just can't afford to do right now. But if the government can, or DARPA can, it's probably something that's money well spent, and it's not huge money.
No, I understand. So kind of keeping with non-traditional investments, the Air Force has recently been looking at high-speed passenger aircraft, supersonic, some even in the media discussing hypersonic for VIP purposes. There are other applications that might be useful, especially in the C2ISR realm. Do you see much growth potential in this area within DoD?
I see growth potential in it for both the DoD and potentially in commercial markets. If you look at how we in general, people have been flying since the beginning of the jet age, we've been flying about the same speed. A lot of the changes that have been made in aircraft are material science, are electronics. Flying's become safer, engines are more reliable, aircraft are lighter, cockpit electronics are better, that kind of thing. But we're still flying around roughly at the same speed. Concorde made the first venture into this space, and it did it at a time where the economics of it were unfortunately, not supportive of it. But the next realm, I really do believe, is speed. And you're seeing some companies out there, private companies like Ariane, companies like Bloom Technologies, who are looking at this. And I think, they're going down a very interesting, important path. And you can imagine applications for if you had a 6 or 8 or 12 person aircraft that can get around the world really, really quick. You could have VIP applications both in commercial and defense markets, but also you could have some, be an interesting way to deploy special forces or whatever if you needed to get, a group of talented warfighters to a part of the world really quickly. This would be a way to do it. So I do think there's a future for it. The pandemic's probably set it back just a little bit, but you got to remember a lot of this stuff's sort of in the early development phases anyway. So it might have shifted things a bit, but I do believe that kind of one of the next levers to be pulled in aviation is speed, supersonic first, and then ultimately hypersonic.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, sir, I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us today. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, we wish you the very best in this time. And as a reminder to our listeners, on Thursday, October 8th, we will be hosting David Albright, the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security, in the latest edition of our Nuclear Deterrence Forum. We're now going to open the session to questions from the audience who have been listening to our conversation. As a reminder to our listeners, if you can participate first by announcing or hitting the raise your hand function, and then announce who you are and your affiliation. With that, we will start off with Q&A question. Question here, can you discuss the impact of new technologies such as hypersonics, directed energy, autonomy, AI on the defense market? Do you see real penetration of these into traditional mission sets? And does this disrupt the prime suppliers?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Do I see it as disrupting the prime suppliers? Probably not. Right. I mean, these are all technologies that will, if they're viable, will work their way into the quiver of arrows that the industry has, and the defense primes and the supply chain will adapt. Maybe a way to think about it is, just a sort of maybe a tangential example. When you saw the way castings and forgings were done in aerospace, that evolved over time. You started using things like powdered metals. That created some new suppliers, but the old suppliers adapted and started, using new techniques. So I don't see it as a threat, but a potential opportunity for innovative firms. And it'll be a way that defense primes evolve. Just as a case in point, Lockheed Martin has a new CEO as of just a couple months, and he's articulated to the investment community some of his views on maybe turning the direction of Lockheed a little bit to more of a tech orientation, and I think that's just a sign of the times. So I would expect companies, most companies, to adjust. Right?
Got a question here from Chris Olson, who's an Air Force fellow with us right now. He asks, the Air Force's Service Acquisition Executive, Dr. Will Roper, frequently cites that during the Cold War, the DoD represented 80% of the nation's R&D budget, whereas today that is flipped, with most R&D dollars being spent by industry. For that reason, he advocates that DoD partner with venture capital to jointly fund promising technology research with dual civilian and military applications. Agility Prime is a notable example of this model. What are your thoughts in this realm, and do you see it being applicable to other technologies? And what's your overall assessment regarding DoD R&D spending versus that of the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, private sector R&D spending outstrips DoD spending. And I mean, ideally, if you could have an interplay with between the DoD and private spending, that's what you'd want to do. The devil's always in the details. How do you do it? So one example comes to mind when you think about silicon and microprocessors. DoD has a need for secure microprocessors. but the microprocessor market that the DoD can support is actually pretty small compared to the commercial microprocessor market. So can you stand up a microprocessor fab just for DoD on commercial scale? Probably not. But can you set up a scheme where you have some carve out of it or a way to set it up that you have, DoD supporting part of it or an aspect of it, so DoD has a supply, a secure supply of commercial grade silicon, but in the framework of a broader commercial enterprise, yeah, you probably can. And just using that as an example, I think that's the way you have to go. Another example is, again, to bring up SpaceX, the interaction that they have had with NASA and the Air Force. That's another example where you've had a private enterprise work pretty symbiotically with government and have a good outcome. So I think I agree. I mean, just in my humble opinion, I agree with Dr. Roper. I mean, that's the way to go. You just have to be careful on how are clever on how you implement it and what you do going forward. But if you can really leverage that commercial R&D spend carefully for defense markets, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Another question typed in here. It's about, we talked about non-traditional space partners in the market right now, whether it be SpaceX or others that are really commercial in a zone that's been far larger with standard primes. But you're also seeing firms like Draken or Top Aces or others in the red air adversary business. You're seeing potential opening up in the training market sector where civilian firms would play. How do you read that market space right now?
Yeah, so specifically that market space, I don't focus on a lot. So I don't want to kind of lead anybody astray on that. But what I will say is that's a trend you've seen in other places. You have seen other companies getting into defense. So just to give you another example, one of the companies we follow is Garmin, and Garmin's known for their wearables and they do avionics. But Garmin got into military avionics through that market, supplying avionics into adversary model adversary aircraft. So you're seeing other how can I say commercial companies get into defense markets through novel means.
Yeah. Well, sir, we're at our time block, so I really appreciate your time. And again, it's great to meet you here. I enjoy listening to you every week. So thank you so much for spending some time with Mitchell Institute.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
No, take care.
Yeah, you bet.